reality, captured in user-friendly symbols and processed for understanding. The Idea Channel.
I'm very glad to introduce our speaker, Milton Friedman, as a friend. Milton, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Bill. I'm going to talk about the economics of medical care. This is an area in which, as we all know, there has been a trend toward ever greater government involvement. Chairman Keating referred essentially to that trend in his comments. One step in this area inevitably leads to another. We have had an expansion of government involvement in the spending of money. Medicare, Medicaid funds, expenditures by the Department of Health, Education, and Welfare for other medical purposes have been growing by leaps and bounds. They have gone from a very tiny portion of the total national expenditures on medical care to a substantial portion. The spending for the provision of medical care inevitably leads to control over the fees that are charged for medical care. And it should. If government is going to spend money, it ought to be concerned with what it pays for what it gets. Control over fees inevitably leads to control over the practices that are followed, over the behavior of the medical personnel. And if this trend continues, it inevitably leads to completely socialized medicine. I believe that this trend, including many of the steps that have already been taken, is very much against the interests of patients, of physicians, and of other healthcare personnel. And in the brief time I have available today, I want to explain why I believe the trend is so much against their interests, why it has occurred, and what, if anything, can be done about it. The trend toward increasing government involvement in healthcare is not an isolated phenomenon. It is not restricted to healthcare. It is part of a general trend in our society toward replacing voluntary free market arrangements by government control and regulation. It is a trend that is happening all over. It has happened in one industry after another. There is nothing special in this respect about the move to replacing private voluntary medical arrangements with compulsory governmental arrangements. This movement in the medical care field is not special in another sense. In industry after industry, producers who protest most strongly their belief in free markets have fostered and helped produce government takeover, government regulation, government control. The oldest case of this, the historical case, was in the railroad industry, where the railroad entrepreneurs helped to foster upon us the Interstate Commerce Commission and all that followed. The same thing has been true in every other area. Most recently, the steel industry, which talks so loudly of its belief in free enterprise, has been strongly in favor of government restrictions on imports, in favor of tariffs and the like. In medicine, the same process has been at work. Indeed, I would say that it is particularly true in medicine. A large part of the pressure for socialized medicine in the United States, in my opinion, and I may say this is not merely opinion, it is based on a considerable examination of the evidence, a large part of the pressure has derived from the policies which have been followed over the decades by the American Medical Association. Policies which were adopted in the name of improving medical care. Policies which I have no doubt that the leaders of medicine regarded as desirable for improving medical care, but policies which have in practice had the effect of restricting entry into medicine, holding down both the quantity and the quality of medical care and inhibiting the most efficient modes of providing and distributing medical care. There has been great progress in the provision of medical care in the United States. It has been a great achievement, but it's been an achievement despite many of the best efforts of the American Medical Association, not because of it. This is a particularly appropriate place to illustrate my point, because the Mayo Clinic is a shining example of how medical care might have developed in the United States if it had not been for the power of organized medicine. The Mayo Clinic started, as you all know, in the late part of the 19th century or the early part of the 20th century. The exact dating is a question of dispute. But the important point is that it started before 1910. 1910 was a year in which there appeared the famous Flexner Report, Abraham Flexner's report on American medical schools, which provided the basis for an enormous expansion in the power and the control which organized medicine was able to exercise over medical education and over medical practice. That power was used effectively in the 1920s and the 1930s and later to hamper at every turn the kind of group practice that Mayo Clinic is so successful at. I venture to predict that if the brothers Mayo had tried to organize the clinic and its practice as they did in the 1920s or 30s, I doubt very much that anything comparable to the Mayo Clinic could ever have developed or been achieved. If you look at the numerous examples around the country of similar attempts, a few managed to survive. The Roos-Toulouse Clinic, many of you know about the case of Washington Group Health, which brought an antitrust suit against the American Medical Association, which it won. Very few occasions have groups of physicians who wish to practice jointly, and particularly in a slightly different arrangement than Mayo's with prepaid care, they had enormous difficulty in getting established because of the concerted opposition of the American Medical Association. This is not the place or the time to explain either why organized medicine took this approach. It was because of certain features of individual practice that no longer are important, in particular the sliding scale, which has disappeared with the emergence of insurance on a wide scale. But whatever the reason, the effects are clear. In my opinion, if the American Medical Association had not exercised the monopoly power which it did over a long period of time, American medicine would have developed very differently than it in fact has. It would have developed, in my opinion, primarily through organizations such as the Mayo Clinic, through joint teams of hospitals and physicians, and I believe that that would have provided more adequate and more inexpensive and higher quality medical care to the American people. To begin with, a greater involvement of government in medicine may seem to serve the interests of at least the purveyors of medical care by providing an additional source of finance. This is a honey that has led persons in industry after industry to support and promote governmental involvement, which has reacted ultimately against them. I have been impressed again and again with how often businessmen, leaders in various areas, who are very farsighted when it comes to their own activities and to concerns within their enterprises, are very short-sighted when it comes to the area of public policy, and allow themselves to be led by small advantages to foster and favor policies which ultimately redound very much to their disadvantage. In the medical case, the initial inducement is that here is a new source of money. And presumably this is why organized medicine has been schizophrenic about the trend toward government involvement. It has, on the one hand, tended to protest against the move toward socialized medicine. It has, on the other hand, engaged in activities which have promoted that development. Most recently, by a commission established by the American Medical Association on the cost of medical care, which it would be very hard to describe as a balanced commission. But although initially it might appear as if the purveyors of medical care could get additional resources by tapping the governmental till, that is a transitory phenomenon. When the government is taking over any activity, there is more money available. But what typically happens is once the government has taken it over, the situation changes. There are no more votes to be gotten by taking it over some more. You have to move on to new fields and take over new areas in order to get some new votes. And the result of that is that those areas already taken over get starved. And instead of there being more resources available, there are fewer. The most obvious example, the most striking example, is Great Britain. As you know, national medicine, socialized medicine, was introduced in Britain immediately after World War II. It is now some 30 years old. There have been a number of careful studies made of the total amount of money now being spent in Britain on medical care and the amount that you might have expected to be spent if you still had an essentially voluntary private system. Estimates made by seeing what the relationship was before the war between income and expenditure on medical care. Estimates made by seeing what fraction of income people in other countries spend on medical care. These estimates show in no uncertain terms that you would be having a larger total sum of funds devoted to medical care in Great Britain today if you did not have a state system of the provision of medicine. In addition to the fact that the ultimate result of a government takeover is less resources, you invariably get lower quality and a lower quantity of medical care. The experience of the United Kingdom is again clear. I am going to cite from a study that was made by a British physician, Dr. Max Gammon, who spent 5 years studying the British Health Service. He wrote a report in December 1976 on the public provision for medical care in Great Britain, and I quote, "National Health Service brought centralized state financing and control of delivery to virtually all medical services in the country. The voluntary system of financing and delivery of medical care, which had been developed in Britain over the preceding 200 years, was almost entirely eliminated. The existing compulsory system was reorganized and made practically universal." He goes on. "No new hospitals were, in fact, built in Britain during the first 13 years of the National Health Service. And there are now, in 1976, fewer hospital beds in Britain than in July 1948 when the National Health Service took over. And I might add, of the hospital beds which there are now in Britain, 2/3 are in hospitals that were built before 1900 by private medicine and by private activity." Mr. Gannon, in a rather amusing way, developed what he called a theory of bureaucratic displacement. He argued that whenever you have any organization taken over by a bureaucracy like a government, what tends to happen is that input goes up and output goes down. That useless work tends to displace useful work in a further extension of Parkinson's laws. And he illustrated it with hospital service in the United Kingdom. He took the 8-year period from 1965 to 1973. In that 8-year period, the hospital staff, the number of people, went up 28%. Incidentally, administrative and clerical help went up 41%. But what about output? What about what they were producing? Input was up. Well, he measured output by the average number of beds occupied daily. It turned out that the average number of beds occupied daily went down by 11%. And he hastened to go on to explain that the decline in the average number of beds occupied was not for want of patients. that at all times there was a waiting list in the neighborhood of 600,000 people waiting for hospital beds. I don't know how many of you know the scandals in Britain about the waiting periods for what is regarded as optional or postponable surgery, including, for example, bypass operations for heart problems. There are stories of people who waited 3 years to have a bypass operation because that could be postponed. Indeed, some of them managed to die before the operation was performed. But 600,000 people waiting on the waiting list, and for rather more readily and more obviously postponable operations, the wait may be much longer than 3 years. Well, Britain is one case. I might add also that, as you know, physicians have been fleeing Britain when they could. The number of physicians annually emigrating from Great Britain to other countries is about 1/3 the number of physicians being graduated each year from their medical schools. As you also know, the process is inexorably moving in Britain. The National Health Service in Britain permitted private practice to exist alongside state practice, but to a very limited extent. There is now strong pressure and movement to try to eliminate private practice altogether and make it compulsory that all practice be in the socialized sector. On the other side of this, there is growing up a voluntary health insurance arrangement with nursing homes and the like to supplement the inadequate governmental provision.